So I think we're at critical mass. So good morning again. I'm Debbie Hart, and I'm the president and CEO of BioNJ, a job that I'm honored to hold. I hope that everyone is safe and well and will continue to be. And thanks for joining us for today's important and timely conversation. So at BioNJ, our mission is to support New Jersey's vibrant life sciences ecosystem and make sure that science is supported, companies are created, drugs are developed, and patients are paramount because patients can't wait. And, today's program is really core to that mission. Clinical development is clearly such an important part of getting therapies and cures to the patients who need them. So I'd like to start out with a special thank you to our incredibly hardworking volunteer committee, co-chaired by Dr. Therese Bandy of Sanofi, Dr. Patrick Heiser of Ferring Pharmaceuticals, and David Rodin, of Amici Clinical Research. Their contributions, along with the committee, have just been incredibly vital to this morning's program. They have carefully curated what you're about to experience, and I think it'll be very interesting, fun, hopefully, and I think ultimately meaningful because we want to look at the landscape and see where we can make a difference. So I'd also like to thank all of our generous sponsors today who make programs such as this one possible. We're going to hear from one of those sponsors in just a moment. To share some opening insights, I'd like to introduce one of our sponsors, the CEO and co-founder of Apprentice.io, based in Jersey City, New Jersey, a New Jersey native and a New Jersey lover. We have that very much in common. Angelo Straquatanio. Angelo, welcome, and thank you so much for being here and your support of this program.
Thanks, Debbie, and good morning, everyone. I hope you all continue to be safe and well through all of this. And I'm very excited about today's program. As Debbie mentioned, the importance and timeliness of this conversation, I think, is incredibly critical because I think, as we all have learned in this last year, the world is depending on life sciences. We're all still very much sitting at home, myself included, waiting for life sciences to finish to help us all get back to some semblance of normalcy. And so for today, it's meant to be very collaborative, very engaging, and using the collective wisdom of the industry to help see if we can solve some of these challenges that are coming up to really usher in the next wave of therapies coming to market. Because COVID is ending, and we are very much close to the tail end of this. And for us in New Jersey, this weekend, we're going maskless here in the state. So let's see what happens. But generally speaking, it should be a really fun event. I'm looking forward to the breakout sessions that are coming up here today, because I really do believe that this industry is really leading the charge and is incredibly critical to the future success of really at a humanity level scale. So I'm very excited about this today, and thank you, Debbie, for kicking things off. And the entire team has been working super hard to make today a very successful event. So thank you all, and I'll see you in the breakout session.
Thank you, Angelo, so much. We really appreciate your support. And so now we're going to take a look at the full industry landscape as well as the pain points in clinical development. So we will be asking some polling questions. So we invite you to, on your phones or whatever device is available, go to Menti, MENTI.com, and you want to key in code 2423-6475. So that's 2423-6475, or you can scan the QR code that's up on the screen now. So my team, if they haven't already, will be putting that code in the chat box as well. So also, as you're perhaps signing into Menti.com, I'd invite you, to think about any questions you have during the program. We welcome you putting them into the chat box for really anyone, including our first official speaker for the day. We are so excited to have with us. And, I wonder if his ears are burning from time to time, because frankly, we talk about him and his organization a lot, at BioNJ when we talk about the cost to bring drugs to market. And the time. And so they measure this on a regular basis and report out. And we're going to hear some insights on that process and those numbers from our speakers. So I'd ask you to please welcome and join me in welcoming Deputy Director and Research Professor at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development at Tufts University School of Medicine, Ken Getz. Ken, thank you so much for being here, and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank BioNJ for the privilege of sharing with you the results of a number of studies that the Tufts Center routinely conducts that really characterize the drug development enterprise and also put some real numbers around pain points and their impact on our current operating conditions. So if we could just go to the next slide, I want to share with you a tradition at the Tufts Center. When we have our staff meetings, we usually mention some of our upcoming presentations. And I told my colleagues what I would be talking about at BioNJ. And the next day, which is customary, one of the faculty usually sends a cartoon or a picture that in some ways captures the essence of the talk from their perspective. And so this is what was in my mailbox the day after our staff meeting. Really puzzled me. I thought maybe this person who happens to love the Rolling Stones was thinking about a particular song like Gimme Shelter or No Satisfaction, Sympathy for the Devil. But he said it had nothing to do with a song itself. What he said is that this is one of his favorite group of people. They work very, very hard and they can perform when they need to, but it's not always a pretty picture. And that's really what I want to use to try to summarize what the drug development operating environment like is today. We all work very, very hard. And as was mentioned earlier, we have some tremendous successes and achievements, but we use a lot of brute force. There's a lot of inefficiency. There are a lot of challenges that I want to talk about as well. So if we go to the next slide, what I'd like to do, and we'll begin actually with a poll, but I'm going to walk through what the current landscape looks like today, and then share with you some hard data that characterizes our operating conditions before the pandemic, and then we'll overlay some of the responses and changes that have occurred as a result of the pandemic. And then we'll transition to look at what this means for us as an enterprise and what opportunities are ahead of us. And I think to many of the comments that have already been made, this is a tremendous and opportune time for us to leverage a number of key capabilities to address these operating conditions. So Debbie, I'll turn it back over to you and we can start the poll.
So thank you so much, Ken. You know, our team was dying to know what that picture represented, and that was very interesting. Your team's approach, so appropriate. So for the audience, your answers to the polling questions, going back to the menti.com, hopefully you were all able to sign on there. And we're going to ask you to answer a series of 4 questions, and your responses will help guide our breakout room discussions. And so for the first question, we would ask you to please indicate the type of entity for which your responses above are most applicable. So we'd ask you to please select one, and we'll give you, a few moments to do that. Okay. Very interesting. Fluctuating a bit, but not really so much, not changing the results. So I think we can wrap up question number 1. Hopefully everyone had a good experience with the polling software, and it'll be even easier for question number 2. So we'd ask you to please indicate the region for which your responses above are most applicable. And again, we'd ask you to select one. Okay, changing just a little bit, nothing that's really altering the overall percentages or overall trends. So I think we'll move to question number 3. So for question number 3, we would ask you to select known pain points in clinical development operations that are most important to you. So we're asking you in this case, I'm sorry, to select 3 of these. What are most important to you? Wow.
It's a lot to choose from.
Yeah, it really is a lot to take in and process and make decisions on and under pressure. Give this one just another moment because it is so much involved.
Clearly, a protocol design and protocol complexity really stands out, but then we're seeing others related to data management and leveraging data, the lessons from COVID, and our response, and obviously talent. That's great.
Okay. Okay, good. So we'll pause there and move on to question number 4. So which one category of clinical development operations pain points is the priority for you? Select one.
Quite a few priorities.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot to think about. Okay. Okay, so we'll leave that one there. So thank you all for participating in the poll. And so Ken, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some insights, and then maybe you'll if you I think we have some time. Maybe we'll send you a few questions. So, but in the meantime, any insights, any thoughts on what you just saw?
Perfect. I think everyone is going to see that the storyline that I'm going to tell touches on every one of these priority areas, and also I think relates many of them, and I think convey why it is often so difficult to choose one over the other. So I'll try to frame these in a way I think that really helps offer insight into where we should focus and leverage in order to improve our current operating environment. So let's go to the first slide, and I'll sort of set the stage. And I'll begin, if you remember our slogan for the day, I'll begin with the prettiest part of the picture that really articulates what we're good at. And that is that we're a remarkably innovative and productive enterprise. You can look at a wide variety of measures. Here I'm showing you one that is more of a constant, and another that has really been just an incredible and unprecedented measure of productivity on the right-hand side. So on the left, we look at the ongoing growth in our drug development pipelines, and we see year over year, 6% increase in the total number of drugs in active clinical trials. Many of these are now coming from smaller and mid-sized companies, but it's really truly remarkable how the innovation engine feeds clinical development activity. Our fastest growing area, oncology, which is also the largest segment of all drug development activity, is growing at an even faster rate, driven by new technologies, genetic sequencing, immuno-oncology, so many of the areas that New Jersey and the tri-state area companies are so deeply involved with. On the right-hand side, you see a more recent measure of remarkable productivity. A year ago at this time, we were developing around 150 treatments and vaccines targeting COVID-19. And we've now increased that number sixfold in a 12-month period. Granted, some of these technologies, some of these vaccines were being developed for similar viruses, but we've applied new technologies. We've been able to mobilize a tremendous amount of energy and innovation to drive productivity. And I'll talk more about this a little later in my presentation. Let's go to the next slide. Another measure of our productivity is by looking at output or our approvals, another measure of output. And although it's a little hard to see in this slide, in any given 3 to 5 year period, we've actually seen a steady rise since early 2000 in the volume of new approvals, with our highest levels that period 2017 to 2020. And also interesting to note here, nearly 2/3 of all approvals are coming through with a priority review or an expedited review pathway, which really signals that these are novel compounds that really warrant an accelerated regulatory pathway because they're addressing a critical unmet medical need. So let's look at what we're not particularly good at, why the picture is not always so pretty, and that's on the next slide. It relates really to the process of innovation. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, we use a tremendous amount of brute force. And later, I'm going to talk about some of the underlying conditions that force us to do that. Here, I'm just showing you the overall typical or average drug development cycle times, 2 different 5-year periods. And since I started measuring development cycle time more than 30 years ago, we have never seen a year when the development cycle has improved or has shortened. It's always getting longer, and it has clearly happened here as well. We're looking typically at an average amount of time of around 8 to 9 years across all therapeutic areas, from IND filing to NDA submission, and then I'm showing you the regulatory review and approval cycle as well. The numbers in the parentheses are coefficients of variation around the mean time. And as those approach 1, they begin to convey a level of inefficiency or variation around the mean time. And over the last decade or so, they've been quite high, which shows that it's even harder to predict how long it will take for any given program that's moving through development. If we go to the next slide, you'll see not at the program level, but at the clinical trial level, these are the average durations across all therapeutic areas by phase. And you'll see that in every case, they're longer now than they were in that earlier 5-year period. And the coefficient of variation around the mean time is very, very high. And in a moment, I'll show you some of the drivers of that inefficiency and drivers of increased cycle time. Let's go to the next slide. Perhaps one of the ugliest parts of our development experience are the high levels of failure. About 88%, nearly 90% of all drugs that enter clinical testing will fail. 12% on average succeed, but it varies widely across a variety of different diseases. In fact, our most active areas in our pipelines are the least successful. Only 1 in 20 drugs that enters the pipeline for oncology, for example, will receive approval. And you can see others in psychiatry and neurology, for example, another very, very active area. The success rates are lower than the average for the entire therapeutic area classes. Let's go to the next slide. And I just want to focus on one other area that articulates our current conditions. And this relates really to the economics of drug development. On the left-hand side, you see the total amount that we spend on R&D annually, and we've now exceeded $160 billion. It's rising by about 5% a year overall. And Debbie, I'll call out a figure that I know is cited frequently, that $2.6 billion, the cost for a single successful drug, that's the capitalized cost. So that takes into account these other operating conditions that I described, the long cycle time and the cost of failures that have to be supported by each success. So only about 13 cents on every dollar we spend covers the direct cost of a successful development program. But about 20 cents on every dollar covers the time value, that 8 or 9 years in development, and actually includes even the years in basic research and preclinical as well. And 70 cents on every development dollar is actually covering the cost of failure. By the way, you probably noticed in the slide that I showed a moment ago that our success rates are getting worse, not better. And so when we look at today at the typical drug entering the marketplace, a much higher percentage are targeting rare diseases, or they're targeting very, very specific subpopulations for which this overall size of the market will not recoup the total capitalized cost to develop that drug over the life cycle, over the life cycle of that product. Let's go to the next slide. So let's go back to our theme and ask the question, what has really produced these not so pretty operating conditions? And there are really 3 primary factors that all of our research comes back to. The first is the executional complexity of our protocols. So right back to the poll responses, many of you recognize that our protocol designs are one of the largest causes of our current operating conditions. And a part of that, a derivative of that, is also the customization in our protocols. No 2 protocols are in any way the same today. And I'll talk about some of the factors that we consistently vary, not just the scientific design of our studies, but the many ways that we execute on them, where we place our trials, some of the technologies that we're now trying to use, the types of sites that we engage in our studies, the planned schedule of assessments. Everything varies dramatically, and it's becoming even more customized, the types of intermediaries that we engage to support our studies. And that really ties into the third area. We're looking today at far more fragmentation in the collaborative environment that supports every study today than ever before. There are more intermediaries involved, and we do not do a good job of coordinating and integrating all of these various parties and players. And an increasing number of players are less familiar with clinical research as we get more of the clinical care environment involved. And as I'll show you later, we're increasingly engaging patients to be the primary source for data. And that's adding another layer of fragmentation as we customize and adapt our studies to be even more patient engaged. So let's go to the next slide and we'll put some data around these areas. And this is one that many of you know we've been studying for over 25 years. It's always hard to show a single slide that captures all of the different complexity measures. So I have cherry-picked a few here, and we're looking at a typical phase 3 pivotal trial. These are all mean values, and I'm looking at the average across several different time periods, 2005, 2011, and 2020. And a few things should immediately jump off the page at you. For one, we've seen nearly a tripling in the number of endpoints. The good news is that the typical phase 3 pivotal trial has 1, maybe 2 primary endpoints and only a couple of key secondary endpoints, where we see all of the growth in scope in our endpoints is coming from the miscellaneous and the tertiary and exploratory endpoints. Total procedures that we perform to collect the data that supports these endpoints has more than doubled, has nearly tripled as well. Total number of countries, total number of investigative sites. These are all areas that introduce additional complexity as we're dealing with more health authorities, we're dealing with more regulatory agencies, we're dealing with the challenges of delivering clinical trial supplies and managing our field force of data monitors, of study monitors. Look at the total number of data points that we collect. This is one that often pushes people off their chairs. In 2005, we were looking at an average of 500,000 data points per phase 3 pivotal trial. We're now looking at an average of 3.6 million data points for a single phase 3 pivotal trial. In oncology, that number is substantially higher. So some of our most active areas are collecting a remarkable amount of data volume. Let's go to the next slide. And that data is coming from an increasing diverse number of sources. This was conducted pre-pandemic, and later I'll show you what it looks like now. It's even more dramatic. What we did is we asked sponsor companies to tell us whether data in the study database was coming from any of the following sources. And 100% told us that data was coming from electronic, or in some cases, paper case report forms, and a high percentage from a local or central lab. But we were already picking up, when we conducted the study several years ago, data coming from smartphones, from mobile health and wearable devices, from eSource, from patient health data, and certainly from electronic and patient-reported outcome assessments. And we asked companies to project what it would look like 3 years into the future, and this was pre-pandemic. And you can see, with the exception of social media, there were very, very high expected levels of contributions from this variety of data sources. So already an acknowledgement that the data, the high volume of data in our study databases, was coming from an increasingly diverse set of sources. And that, I think, reflects some of the customization, and also some of the challenges that we typically encounter as we're introducing data coming from more sources that move outside the traditional case report form and central lab model. Let's go to the next slide. And another way to think about fragmentation is to look at the global community of intermediaries that support our research activity. On the left-hand side, you see again that growth in global R&D spending annually at that $160 billion level in 2020, but it's segmented now, and for some reason it doesn't show up on the slide, but the segments are, the blue segment is the internal and infrastructure spending. The beige segment is for CROs and technology vendors, which is actually the largest area of spending today, really reflecting our reliance on so many outside parties. And the smallest segment, that 15 billion, is the investigative site grants that are spent on FDA-regulated clinical trials each year. We see on average nearly 40,000 investigative sites, unique sites that are supporting the conduct of clinical research, and over 3,000 contract clinical and technology service providers. And every one of these providers requires qualification assessment. There's a great deal of time that is required to ensure that these parties are compliant with ICH, GCP, and that they meet so many other criteria. And that adds a great deal of time to getting our program started. And of course, we have to manage all of these disparate parties, especially many of the technology providers that are now introduced into our programs. The key takeaway with all of those factors, the high level of customization, the high level of intermediary involvement, and the high complexity, all of these factors together are inversely related to performance. As they increase, our efficiency, the cost of our development activity and our performance, our cycle times, for example, and our quality suffer. So let's go to the next slide. Just to give you some flavors for this, here I'm looking at some outcome measures: study initiation duration, study conduct duration, closeout duration. Conduct duration, for example, is defined as first patient, first visit to last patient, last visit. Closeout is last patient, last visit to database lock. And then I'm showing you two other measures: number of substantial amendments, which, as many of you know, are highly disruptive, but they're unbudgeted and unplanned. And the last area are our dropout rates. Every one of these areas has increased dramatically over a 10-year period, their length or the rate. And these are all significantly correlated with complexity and customization and fragmentation. The areas that are the most significant relate to those that can receive the downstream impact from complexity. Typically, when we start our study, there are some of the complexity variables that we have to get used to, but it's the downstream burden of administering our protocols and the burden on our study volunteers that really challenges our cycle times and our performance. So the manifestation of complexity is really felt over the duration of the trial. Let's go to the next slide and we'll see other measures of impact. This is now coming directly from our patients, sort of a before and after. When SysGroup asked people who had reviewed the informed consent form but chose not to participate, what was the primary factor that contributed to that decision? Hands down, the largest area was their expected burden of participation and the challenge that they felt they would have in adhering to the protocol requirements. On the right-hand side, you see a question that was asked after participation had ended. And participants were asked, what did you like least about being in your clinical trial? And 4 of the 5 areas that they liked least relate to the burden of participation. The location of the site, that study visits were too time-consuming, that they weren't compensated adequately or sufficiently given what was expected of them, or that the procedures themselves were too cumbersome. Let's go to the next slide. We have many measures of quality, and here are just a few for you. We have seen the average number of substantial amendments rise over time, and a high percentage of amendments are typically implemented before the first patient has even received the first dose, which for many is a clear indication that in our haste to get the protocol out to the research center, we don't have enough time to even think about the feasibility of the study and the design of the protocol itself. I'm also showing you the average number of deviations for a typical phase 3 pivotal trial and how pervasive those deviations are across the number of patients within the trial itself. And it's quite high, especially in oncology studies. On the right-hand side, you see the average number of complaints that the FDA receives each year. And this is only goes through 2017, the year that this data is provided by FDA. We saw a huge increase between 2001 and 2005. And that was in part because there were more ways that you could anonymously file a complaint with the FDA. There was an 800 number provided. You could fill out a form online. But the number has stayed very high since that 2001 period, or that 2005 period. The number one reason an FDA complaint is filed is for protocol noncompliance. Let's go to the next slide. And I'd like to transition now. I've given you a flavor for our operating conditions pre-pandemic, if you will. Let's now look at what we've done during the pandemic. And so here I want to first point out the remarkable speed that we have brought to our development activity. We've literally been able to deliver COVID-19 vaccines especially our Operation Warp Speed vaccines, in only 30% of the time. We've shaved 5 years or 60 months off of our timeline. And there were many things that we've done, and you are all aware of so many of them. We've seen much more proactive and accommodating regulatory agency involvement. We've actually seen a number of companies find ways to collapse phase activity and actually conduct phase 2 and phase 3 activity in parallel. Some companies have done a very good job of reducing the time between the end of phase 2 and the beginning of phase 3, so the compression of white space between phases. We've certainly seen a tremendous amount of open collaboration and data sharing. And we've also seen very, very fast deployment of remote and virtual technology solutions, and a number of organizations really trying to apply more advanced and augmented analytics, including machine learning. So lots of areas that have impacted and supported our singular focus on delivering COVID-19 vaccines during this global health crisis. But behind this have been factors that are also contributing to a long-term, less pretty picture. And we have to anticipate some of the areas that are going to continue to present a challenge to us. And that's on the next slide. So we can celebrate our successes, but we have to recognize that we've brought a tremendous amount of additional incremental brute force in order to address the pandemic. And we've done this because we are so committed to addressing this critical global health need. In this particular slide, it's based on a set of themes that came from in-depth interviews with a global community of investigative sites. And what we heard consistently were 3 positive areas. There's certainly recognition of the incredible way that sponsor companies and regulatory agencies responded and adapted to the requirements of the pandemic. And most sites are very pleased with the additional convenience that remote activity has offered and the additional choice that it's offered. But without exception, sites are pointing to increased workload, and a number of sponsor and CRO personnel are pointing out the same thing, that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty as even more fragmented and siloed parties are involved. And also that if we start to look at our cycle times, there are even more delays that are being introduced, trying to get new vendors who are not familiar with the clinical research enterprise and activity, getting them up to speed, or the delivery of clinical supplies directly to patients' homes, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide. And this now is really driven by responses from sponsor companies. It comes from a study that the Avoca group recently completed. And what it shows you is a bit of where the pendulum may ultimately fall. A lot of the thinking that we are going to move into a world where we can expect only decentralized clinical trials is not supported by the data. But if anything, we will enter more of a hybrid environment where many of the options that were offered will be considered, but on a trial by trial or protocol by protocol basis. Here, Avoca is listing a number of sources for data and of decentralized clinical trial support, remote monitoring, telemedicine visits, home visits, ship to home supplies, et cetera. The first column of numbers shows you the number or the percentage of companies that were using these approaches prior to the pandemic, and most usage was on a pilot basis. And then there's another group that indicated that they started to use these approaches once the pandemic had started. The final group shows you where there is anticipated continued use, strong continued use. And in every case, it looks like the pendulum will swing back to a more modest area where there will be more scrutiny. And most notably, if you look at telemedicine visits and home visits and ship to home supplies, areas that can be very, very difficult to manage, that are heavily regulated, that are costly and disruptive to standard operating activity. So lots that has to be accommodated and managed in order to ensure that these approaches can be integrated into our operating activity. If we go to the next slide, you see some of the primary areas that are noted as the challenges to the adoption of these approaches. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see 5 key areas, and that I've already echoed for you. The challenge of integrating many of these approaches, that the vast majority do not have a clear return on investment. We entered into their use during the pandemic out of necessity, and in many cases, funding was made available through Operation Warp Speed and other government supported areas. And there have been lots of shared risks as we've introduced much of our activity to a broader community of intermediaries. If we go to the next slide, one last area that I want to highlight is, again, the patient community. And we've all celebrated and marveled at the increased level of awareness in clinical research activity as a result of media coverage of the pandemic. But at the same time, our accelerated speed and a great deal of misinformation, a lot of it politicized, has elevated public perceptions that our clinical trials are unsafe. And it's also elevated the level of unwillingness to participate in our clinical trials, most notably among minority communities where the incidence and the severity of COVID-19 is higher. So these are all challenges that we have to anticipate moving forward. So what I'd like to leave you with before we turn it over for any questions is on the next slide and the one after that. And this really will be some of the implications and the opportunities that are introduced. Number one, we have no reason to believe that the complexity and customization of our protocols and our trials will ease, will be reduced. Every indication suggests that complexity is inevitable and it will grow. And the pandemic has introduced a number of approaches that will create more choice, all of it driven by the preferences of the patients in our studies, and we'll be segmenting those preferences. Some patients will prefer more personal contact, others will prefer more virtual and remote support. And I think we can expect to see more studies that try to balance and juggle all of that simultaneously. A lot of that juggling is going to be transferred to the investigative site personnel and to a lot of our contract providers who will have to really support these hybrid and highly customized models. So instead of thinking about protocol simplification and a reduction in customization, we have to apply other critical principles to manage and mitigate the risks of complexity and flexibility further. And there's a lot of discussion about the use of agility, for example, and how do we create teams that can find a way to manage all of this complexity in a very, very nimble way. And there's a lot that's been written about agility and certainly the flexibility of our infrastructure as well. Many are really exploring how we reduce our fixed operating elements and become more variable operating activities where we're engaging a more open collaborative model. If we go to the next slide, and my last slide, I'll just focus on a bit more of that. As we think about our hybrid environment with more intermediaries, we have to rely even more heavily on open collaboration where even more data is shared. And so we need flexible infrastructure and systems that enable access to a global community of external and internal parties working together. We can expect more data volume, and we have to find ways to leverage the value of that data, not only clinical data, but operating data, management data, data that informs the management of risk so that we can more smartly and nimbly manage our operating activity. So with that, let's just go to the last slide. And I again want to thank BioNJ for the privilege of being able to share with you this description of a not so pretty picture, but again, with our ability to leverage many of these opportunities, we can improve what this picture will look like in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was so interesting, so fascinating, and so important. And it's interesting because your comments really tied directly into the top 3 pain points as identified by our audience. And so, so the good news is Ken is staying with us until the very end. And so we'll move now into our breakout rooms where we'll discuss some of we'll discuss those pain points. And I'll tell you sort of how that's going to happen in just a moment. And then when we come back, we'll have time for more discussion and report out. So you don't need to do anything. It will just take a minute or two. Our team will move you into a designated room. And so the top 3 pain points were protocol designs are not optimal. So that will be discussed in group room numbers 1 and 2. And then implementation of lessons learned from COVID will be discussed in rooms 3 and 4. And then data entry, verification, and flow in clinical trials will be discussed in rooms 5 and 6. So in your rooms, you will get a 2-minute warning, allowing you to finish up your discussions. There will be a group leader and a BioNJ team member in each room, so it will be highly facilitated. Then we'll move back for the readout at about 10:10. So thank you and enjoy. And again, just your patience for just a moment while we move you into those rooms. And thank you again, Ken, for really an extraordinary presentation.
My pleasure.
And the work that you do calculating those numbers, I can only imagine. Yeah. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you all had a productive discussion. And we are going to dive right in because, as we know, unfortunately, due to technology in the age of COVID, we have some abbreviated time. So thanks to all of our leaders, we're going to go right away to Angelo and to report out on your individual room and your pain point and what you heard.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. And thank you, everyone who participated in our breakout session. We had Rob, Allison, Alexis, and Armin, who are participating in our breakout session, talking about the challenges around protocol development and how they come to market, and the opportunities that can come out of this, especially this COVID event that I think there was a lot of learnings from. But really, I think what I took away from it and what the printout from our session was that overall, as we learned from Ken, the complexity of protocols are greatly increasing. That is a trend line that is going to continue to stay. But interestingly, one of the big things that we took away from our session was that in that design, the inclusion-exclusion criteria in and of itself has also ballooned and become incredibly complex, which then leads to lower levels of recruitment. And when there's lower levels of recruitment, it then extends out the timeline that it takes to actually deploy and be successful with a number of these trials. But one of the interesting things that was taken out of the conversation, Rob actually participated in and ran a number of the COVID trials. Hopefully, Rob, I can share that with the group here. But one of the big takeaways was that the protocols themselves were actually simple, and that the inclusion-exclusion criteria was simple. And through that simplicity and overall collaboration between the site and the sponsor, it actually drove a very fast and fairly easy recruitment process, which then became very successful for the team. So interestingly, even though COVID was wildly complex, the protocols and inclusion-exclusion criteria were still fairly simple. And on top of that, though, the opportunities that can come out of all of this, a lot of the stuff that we learned here today was that even though there's been a massive shift towards digital, still there's many sites that are still running on paper. And hopefully Ken's data is wrong, that we'll go back to paper and revert back to the mean, because there really needs to be a change here and a shift towards digital to really leverage a lot of the capabilities of new technologies to then drive both not only efficiency, but richer levels of collaboration with the sites and sponsors. And so I thought it was an incredibly interesting conversation, a little short on time there, but one that I do believe can usher in the next wave of therapies that are coming out here, because ultimately they're only going to increase in complexity. And I really do think that there's a number of opportunities that can be had. And so thank you to the folks that participated in our breakout session, because it really was super interesting.
Great. Thank you, Angelo. And just, we have literally 10 minutes left till our official stop time. So I'd ask each of the presenters to spend, a minute 40-ish. And so be as succinct as possible, please. There will be continuing conversation. So you'll hear more about that in the close when Therese closes us out. So Therese, over to you.
Okay, so I think what we heard from Ken, that complexity, customization, hybridization, that's all here to stay. And my group was Brian, Christopher, and Sitaram, and we all agree with that, definitely. But the one thing that's also here is the unnecessary complexity in terms of the number of sites required, the number of endpoints, even in mature drugs. For a new indication or just simply a new route of administration is turning out to be a bear. And so, of course, quality, cycle time, probability of success, they all suffer. But one of the things the group was able to identify as being a root cause is actually that FDA has gone virtual. In some cases, they're not even holding meetings. It's a paper transfer. There's a lot of nebulous, things about the answers the FDA is giving. So what happens, what do sponsors or people, small biotechs do? They build in complexity in the hopes of addressing any potential future questions of the regulatory body. Now, there was a lot more in discussion, but I want to leave it on that point. I don't think we went to the solution phase, but we definitely understand the impact. But there was more, but we'll save it for the white paper, which I'll talk about in a little bit.
Great. Thank you, Therese. And Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. I have a challenge saying anything in a minute and 40 seconds, but I'll do my best. But I think the group that I had with Heather and Sonia and Roberta and Donna, we were tasked with identifying the challenges with implementing some of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly as they relate to the conduct of clinical trials. So clearly, we had a really interactive discussion. The points that were mentioned, were the use of virtual informed consent documentation, which was really important to allow trials to progress during the pandemic. But in the case of Sanofi, which was represented in my group, it was actually even more important since the paper documents themselves could potentially be considered infectious if they were being handled by a COVID patient, which I thought was a useful insight. And obviously the lessons learned there in terms of facilitating virtual conversations for consenting, I think will endure. There was also a lot of discussion about telemedicine and some of the benefits that they might have going forward. The reference that was made during our discussion was about oncology patients who are immunocompromised. And so, limiting the number of times they have to come into a center and potentially put themselves at risk of acquiring something, not just during a pandemic, but in normal times, obviously has benefited. And so does, of course, maintaining patient engagement in terms of making things easier for them to remain compliant with the protocol. And finally, we're just getting into an interesting discussion about remote monitoring and how source documents will be verified in a time when you can't visit centers. And that there was a comment made that some centers have even indicated that even after the pandemic ends, that they would prefer not to have monitors coming into their sites. And so that poses some challenges, and clearly there's a need for solutions that would make remote monitoring more efficient. And I think I finished in a minute and 40 seconds, but I wish we had more time both here to discuss those insights further, as well as I wish we had more time in my group to further the discussion. But I thank everybody for their participation.
And again, this conversation will continue. And Patrick, great job with the minute and 40. We appreciate it. Christine, over to you.
Well, my group, I kind of joined a little late, and I have to give them credit. They were in full-on discussion when I joined. They probably didn't need me to facilitate, but some of the things we talked about related to implementing lessons learned from COVID was related to all these technologies that we have started to implement in clinical studies, such as the remote monitoring and other things. And so one of the challenges we saw for continuing to implement those solutions in clinical trials is really related to convincing our upper management and that it's worth it to spend on these technologies. I think they saw the value of spending on it when it was related to COVID, But I think there's still a lot of these we felt that there were a lot of these technologies still add a lot of value to clinical trials. And it's trying to figure out how best to sort of position that within our companies to keep these technologies with us. And, things like remote monitoring, is there, can you say, okay, it costs X amount to bring this technology in, but you're saving X amount on business travel expenses. And it's sort of finding that leverage to keep some of these technologies in place. There was also some discussion right when I joined talking about how to mitigate some of the fragmentation that's been happening within clinical trials, and looking for standardization and some infrastructure, and trying to find ways to help the industry as a whole align on standards by using bio and pharma stakeholders. So I think we had a little bit of a hybrid of the protocol group and the lessons learned from COVID. But really great discussion on our end, and probably something that needs to be continued in further forums.
And certainly it will be. Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it. David, over to you.
Great, thank you. So our group was looking at data entry verification and flow in clinical trials with Martina, Greg, and Jack, and Debbie Minton. So just as a summary, we were looking at there's a lot of data, very complex. It's difficult and slow entry across various sources, and data quality continues to be a concern, obviously. Without going through all the causes, I think it's probably worth mentioning that we didn't really focus on the protocol, but naturally the protocol is really behind many of the things that could make data a lot easier. But aside from that, we talked about systems requiring better validation, sites performing direct data entry instead of first onto paper or their own source would be better, improved training, the use of more common systems and standards, even standard code libraries used across the industry, consider piloting data entry, verification, and flow before the study starts instead of us figuring it out once we start the trial. And more systems that can help identify incorrect data early on. And then finally, the possibility of some kind of e-source verification automation. So those are some of the themes that came up in our group.
Terrific. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And Terry Makovitz, over to you.
Great. So thanks. We had Jane, Leslie, Michael, and Debbie in our group, and we had a really great discussion from different perspectives from the industry setting. Root cause from the data verification collection perspective was really targeting the volume of data that we're collecting in our studies, and that's driven by the fact that sponsors aren't getting feedback from FDA until later in the drug development study process when the statistical analysis plan is submitted. And therefore we're loading up, as Ken had discussed, our trials with a huge amount of endpoints. So one of the recommendations would be to streamline and minimize the number of amendments to decrease the complexity and ensure that the statistician is integrally part of any discussions with health authorities so that the data collection is tied directly to what analyses will be needed to support approval of a product. And one of the challenges that the team noted also from a source document verification perspective was patient privacy. That's very, very much fluid globally. As we know in Europe, patient privacy laws are much more stringent, which does limit the amount of and how remote monitoring, for example, can be done. So a lot of great discussion, and I think it supports what David and his team had noted as well.
Thank you, Terry, so much. And so now we're going to move quickly to, before I say a very brief thank you and next step to Terry. You've heard from Therese Bandy from Sanofi. She is the co-chair and committee co-chair and head of operations for global medical capability development for Sanofi. So Therese, over to you.
Okay, so I'm also going to say thank you all the registrants, Ken Speaker, BioNJ team, and fellow co-chairs, David Rodden, Patrick Heiser, and also all the clinical development members. So, but I'd also like to just mention, as you mentioned, next steps. We're going to collect all these insights, as Angela said, from your collective wisdom. We're going to synthesize that as a clinical development committee into a BioNJ white paper for distribution in the near future. And very importantly, based on these results, our committee will be able to set value added goals for 2021 and 2022, again, based on your input to more or less address our overall mission, which is to improve the clinical trial infrastructure in the region and also the access for patients to trials in the region. So we can also plan subsequent briefings, and they can be just as collaborative in nature as this one, which I think we've all realized from the COVID era, it's so important. So thank you again to everyone, and I'll turn it back over to Debbie.
Thank you, Therese. And if anyone, if you're a BioNJ member and you would like to join the Clinical Development Committee, please give any of our team members a shout. I know the group would welcome your participation to continue this important conversation. So thank you to our speaker, Ken. Phenomenal. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And fun too, actually, I have to say, even though not all of it was good news, but great job. Our amazing committee, again, they really curated a special program for us today. Apparently Zoom's been having some issues today. Our team learned, clearly we experienced some of them. Apologies for that. Our sponsors, Angelo, thanks for being with us as well. All of you for joining us. And we do hope that you found the discussion valuable. You'll help us continue the conversation. Let us know how we can help you at any time, bionj@bionj.org. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everyone.